agradecemos tomar sus asientos ya que
Good
estamos a
morning.
punto de
Would you
iniciar la
please
segunda
take your
sesión.
seats because
Muchas
we're about
gracias.
to start our second session of the day. Thank you very much. Our second panel. We ask that you take your seats, please. Session number 3 of this fourth forum on Latin American democracy. It's called Democracies for the Poor, Challenges of Democracy Facing Inequality. Before beginning with our panel, I would like to thank the attendance of our speakers for supporting us in an altruistic way to make this forum a reality. You have been able to witness their technical ability to make this great effort of civic training that we are doing at the OEAS, IFES, FCE, COMEX, and IDEA. The moderator of our panel would be Francisco Guerrero, who is counselor for the Flavia Electoral Institute. Thank you, Manuel. Welcome. And good morning, everyone. As you may know, we are in our third session of the day of the forum. Who has a question for us? Democracies for the Poor, the challenges of democracy facing inequality. Today we have an extraordinary panel. All of you have in your program the personalities who are with us today. Ciro Murayama is with us. He is an outstanding academic and public servant of Mexico. He has been a teacher and a researcher at several universities in Mexico and the U.S., among which are ITAM, CIDE, the Harvard University, and Georgetown University and American University in Washington, D.C. With us is also Eveline Herfkens, a Dutch politician. She was executive coordinator in the United Nations for the Secretary General for the Campaign for the Millennium Development Goals. She was Minister for Development Cooperation in the Netherlands between 1998 and 2002. She also served as an extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassador and permanent representative of the Netherlands to the United Nations. She was member of the Economic Commission of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And also with us is Navin Chawla. He is an Indian politician. He has served as director of the Delhi Financial Corporation in India, also as a finance secretary and secretary of labor and chairman of Committee of Electricity. He also collaborated on the International Labour Organization. He is recognized as one of the leading biographers of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. He was chairman of the Election Commission of India between 2009 and 2010. Our third panelist, and I should thank that between all the activities with which she's involved in the last days due to the natural disasters that we've lived in our country, especially in the state of Guerrero. We have today Rosario Robles with us. She holds a degree in economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She has a master's degree in rural development. She was a member of the Democratic Revolution Party, which she presided at one time. In addition, she is the only woman to have held the position of head of government of Mexico City. Since 2012, she serves as the Secretary of Social Development with President Enrique Peña Nieto. With us is also Flavia Freidenberg. She is a Spanish-Argentinian scholar. She has been a consultant for at the University of Salamanca, and she's head of the Latinoamericana magazine Hoy. She has been a consultant for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, International IDEA, and also at the UN Development Program. She has also been a visiting professor in universities in Latin America, Spain, and France. The dynamic that we will follow today is that each speaker will have a chance of sharing their point of view for a 10-minute time, and we will be receiving the questions of the audience. And we will also have enough time for our guests to give answer to these questions. Before beginning, I would just like to say that this democracy topic and its linkage with the combat against poverty is undoubtedly a main topic in Latin America, where we are constantly asking if all the money that we are investing in the electoral processes is being translated into a process of political representation that generates public policies that are useful for the people. It seems to be that surveys are sometimes showing that people are not completely satisfied with their democracy, particularly because the efficiency of these public policies is not being reflected in improving the quality of life. All of our speakers today have studied all these topics. Many of them have actually lived this poverty combat, whether as economists, administrators, or heads of political parties. And it is evident that today is a great opportunity to listen to what they have to say in this perspective against this fight against poverty, and the participation of democracy and the Democrats in solving these problems. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Ciro Murayama, thanking him, asking him if he could stick to the 10-minute time that he has. Thank you very much, Councilor Guerrero. Thank to the organizers of this event for their invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning, and I'm also honored to share this panel with distinguished speakers. As we have very few time, I'm going straight to the topic, and I'm going to talk specifically about Mexico. During a good part of the 20th century, our country had a growth with accelerated rates in what was called stable development. We had growth rates of 6% per year. However, this time was fractured at the beginning of the 80s with what was called by the CEPAL, was named the lost decade that followed the debt crisis that we had. Then in Mexico we started to go deeper into the democratic demands that had as a background the great crisis of 1968, and that during the 70s spreaded with different worker, labor mobilizations, and that made place to two important guerrilla movements that people didn't think could generate a change through pacific means, through peaceful means. However, in 1967 we had a political reform that incorporated several other parties in the electoral system, especially a communist party, and we had a virtuous change that was gradual and was accentuated in the 1980s as a result of the fall of the economic expectations, and also of the possibility of people to continue getting welfare, in such a way that the economic crisis of the 80s was a key ingredient favoring these democratic claims and the democratizing process, in a way that in 1988 the candidacy of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas was at risk. For the first time, with this candidate was the first time that the PRI was at risk of losing the president seat in decades. By 1997, an important and significant fact in the political history of Mexico occurred. That was when the president of Mexico lost, and their party lost control of the lower chamber. They didn't have a majority, and the government they were forced to make pacts with the other political forces in such matters as income laws and budgetary issues of the state, in such a way that we had a change from a hegemony partidary system and a presidentialism system to a plural system of parties that had a voice in the lower chamber. In the year 2000, PRI loses the president's seat, and we have alternates, and they don't have a majority with the lower chamber and no longer at the Congress. And it's not until later that we have confirmation of a Congress in which just one party has a majority. We had different balances of the power. We can see how the alternation and the shifts of power are very visible every single day. Mexico was able to go advancing into towards this hegemony partidary system, towards a democratic life. However, if I agree with the question of this panel, what we haven't been able to do is making that this democratic regime starts to translate into an improvement in the life conditions of our population. Since 30 years ago, Mexico has had a very low growth. We are at times that a very renowned professor, Rolando Cordera, has called a stabilizing plateau, in contrast to a stabilizing development of the last decade, in a way that the unincorporation of the majorities to welfare served at one certain moment to favor the shift towards democracy. What could be asked or questioned right now is the legitimacy of the democratic system. I'm going to give you some figures. According to the Social Policy Evaluation Committee, we presented the report on poverty in Mexico about a couple of months ago, said that of the 160 million inhabitants in Mexico, 53.3 million are poor. This is 45.5%. And if we go to rural areas, poverty increases up to 62%. If we go to indigenous communities, 3 of 4 indigenous live in poor conditions. Of the 60 million Mexicans, 51% has an income that is lower to the welfare limit. And we see what happens with the distribution of income.
te lleva solo el 1.2% de todo el producto
1.2% of the GDP goes to the seal, and there's a difference between the top and the lowest seals of 300. We are talking about figures that are a great difference between these two segments. But why is democracy been so unaware of the claims of inequality? I think that the democratic transformation occurred in our country in a historic moment that it's internationally characterized by the a great growth of political conservatory, an alternation that has been changing the economic policy that could be identified with economic policy of Washington, that it's different from what has happened in other countries in Latin America. In this conservative wave that was installed in Mexico and was supported by several organizations and was instrumented by the president, particularly between the 80s and the 90s, when we had the change in the development model that we followed. There was also a shift in a change towards a public participation of the state. So there is no longer a legitimization of the state as an instrument for equity. Now in Mexico we are seeing how there's a reaction in all kinds of, in all the sense of this word, to every initiative that implies redistribution through the tax methods. Mexico is in Latin America the country with the least tax income. After Haiti, we are at 11%, and more than a third part of our public expenditure is financed by oil income. So against this tax collection, we have a very low capacity of redistributing this income. The distribution of income before tax is way different after taxes and transferences are done, in a way that this conservative point of view that happens in the existing political parties has allowed that democracy has become now an instrument to redistribute the income.
PPAN, which is to the right of the political sphere, has reacted against any increase whatsoever in taxes. And paradoxically, part of the left wing has also done it. In Mexico, we don't have a political force that presents a totally leftist political speech. So those are the political stakeholders, and if they don't pay attention to equity and equality, nobody else is going to do it, especially the economic elites. So in order to close my first participation, I would say democracy for the poor? No. What we still had in Mexico, taking into account the red circle of the public opinion, it's a democracy that is totally functional for the wealthiest one, as their interests are not being affected at all. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, agradecemos a Ciro Murayama.
Thank you, Mr. Ciro Murayama. And just as an apostille, I must say that actually, yes, when we talk about economic projects, also political parties behave based upon the electoral stage in which they are, and if they are close or far away from the office that they are expecting to win. We have seen that on many occasions a political force accepts certain types of measures just because that will give him the possibility to win elections, and as soon as that political party takes office, everything changes. So we should be careful and think if we as citizens are doing the role of the auditors that is needed in order to make sure that the public policies are actually put into practice. We're going to pass the floor to our second panel member, and it's Eveline Herfkens. She is the Netherlands Minister of Economic Development. Les pido una disculpa, me voy a dirigir a ustedes en inglés, pero les doy tiempo para que se pongan sus audífonos. Cuando digo gracias por invitarme aquí es porque realmente es un placer para mí. O sea, estar aquí y hablar sobre estos aspectos es realmente una excelente experiencia. Y encontrar una conformación
obviously should be the case that higher levels of inequality are not just morally objectionable, but they are damaging for social stability and to economic growth itself. And yes, in countries with higher economic inequality, democracy is less likely to come about and more likely to break down. So inequality matters a lot. But let me first qualify, inequality is not just about income. It is about, just as poverty is not just about income, it is about exclusion, it is about powerlessness, it is about insecurity. Just read Amartya Sen. Poverty doesn't only undermine economic and social rights, it also undermines political and civil rights. And the same is true for inequality, and it's actually even more true for inequality, as I hope to elaborate. But I first want to say a few words about the link between growth and inequality, because we had a debate for the last decades about that link, and I'm really happy that by now there is general consensus, including at the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, etc., that inequality hampers long-term growth because it reduces social mobility and it weakens demand. Enabling people who are marginalized to improve their living conditions unleashes their economic potential. It increases overall productivity, and that spurs growth. So extreme inequality also gets in the way of developing the important preconditions that you need for growth: education and decent institutions. If the rich can afford to send their kids to school while avoiding paying for education for all, that's a bad situation. And in societies with extreme inequalities, you also see that the institutions that developed happen to be benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the bulk of the population. In Latin America, exclusionary institutions have evolved because of extreme differences in wealth, income, access to capital, political influence from the outset since colonial times. And the wealthy were able to generate the rules and the laws and the government policies, and that gave them more access to economic opportunities. Regulations regarding the organization of corporations, regulations regarding financial institutions were framed in a way that the wealthy have access and the poor would not. So in short, high inequality is associated with poor institutions, with rent-seeking policies, and with low human capital creation, and all that retards growth. And that brings me to the second link, the one between growth and democracy. Now, China was briefly mentioned yesterday, so this one is a bit less straightforward. But interesting enough, both for growth and for democracy, two issues are key: education and the quality of institutions. Once democracy is established, it thrives on growth. I've been a politician of half of my professional life, and for sure, the economic pie needs to grow if you want to make the kind of trade-offs and balancing acts that you have to make if you put together a party platform or a government coalition. And when growth falters, democracy is at risk. Just look at Europe today. Growth falters, and you see the rise of populist parties that peddle a dangerous brew of nationalism and xenophobia. But also in poorer countries, democracies have a much better chances to survive if their economies are growing. And democracy is even more likely to survive if inequality is declining. The link between democracy and inequality is very strong. Democracy requires social inclusion. It requires institutions that allow sharing power to give the poor a place, to give the poor a voice. And the exclusionary institutions that develop in highly unequal societies fail to do so. And they lack the institutional checks and the balances, and the elites can keep power and keep access to their rents. So inequality is a significant predictor of political instability, of inadequate rule of law and less democracy. And actually Aristotle already said that. He identified economic inequality as a powerful destabilizing factor that would ultimately bring down democratic governments. Now, democracy starts with elections, and in fact, more equal societies have introduced universal suffrage, at least for man, long before less equal societies, which kept restrictions regarding schooling or wealth. But we know that democracy doesn't end with elections. There are more, and I would say personally, even more important characteristics. Citizens being equal before the law, accountability of elected officials, embedded in a network of institutionalized power relations, so checks and balances are in place to the exercise of power. Now, in case of extreme inequality and poverty, political citizenship is disabled when the illiterate and the poor are less able to exercise their political citizenry. And citizens need to be able to exercise their social and economic rights in order to exercise their political rights. And yesterday many speakers made the point that democracy requires the expansion of citizenship. It requires social citizenship. Democracy implies the distribution of power in order for rights on paper to become actual rights. And the huge economic and social inequalities in Latin America have directly affected the public capacity to deliver citizen social rights, and instead reinforce structures for economic and political power that just perpetuate inequality. Whoever holds the wealth holds the power, the states being captured by elites and the poor lacking voice and agencies. So inequality needs to be dealt with in order to obtain democratic stability. But there is a little bit more to this. Yes, improved living standards foster democracy, but individuals need to embrace the values that make democracy strong. And that only happens if development is accompanied by equality, because you need that social capital, or rather more specific, you need social trust. Social trust is the social fabric on which democracy rests. It's about a sense of community which allow you to overcome political differences. It facilitates political cooperation among citizens, and without such generalized interpersonal trust, democracy is not possible. And social trust simply doesn't come about in an environment characterized by high inequality and conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. It breeds mistrust. The poor mistrust not just the rich, but their own government, their officials, their politicians. They feel threatened and intimidated by the police. They feel ignored by their politicians. They feel belittled by the ruling class, and they feel gagged by their political system. And in too many poor countries, the lyrics of the International Socialist Anthem still ring true. I say this in Spanish. La ley nos burla y el Estado oprime. When high poverty and inequality converge, and it did in Latin America, the end result is a society, masses of poor and a little very rich elite. And there is trust, mistrust, also on the side of the rich. The rich feel more opposed, they feel insecure, They tend to discriminate against the poor. They cannot identify with their plight. They have no empathy for them. And then they can't identify with their cause. And thus, they will not support distributional public policies. So only by reducing inequality can you increase interpersonal trust. And then solidarity and not conflict will prevail. But on the other hand, it's exactly that lack of trust that makes distribution so difficult. So this seems to be a trap. Inequality, poverty, instability, and it takes political leadership to break through. And it is a chicken and egg problem. Dealing with inequality is essential to foster democracy, but genuine democracy is needed to adequately deal with inequality. Now, Latin America has been stuck for centuries in that trap, in this perpetuating vicious circle. But somehow over the last decade, and I was very interested in the explanations that President Fernandez gave this morning, the pattern has cracked. Democratization has made some dent in the concentration of power, an expansion of education, increased opportunities of the poor, more active, progressive social policies, you mentioned the programs, and indeed, the Gini coefficient is improving, and that's a very sticky coefficient, so this is quite a miracle. But there, and that has been said enough yesterday also, is still a long way to go, and we're not sure if change will actually stick. Latin America still is the most unequal region in the world, and in most countries, public spending continues to be regressive, not progressive, even in spite of all these wonderful, successful social programs. Other people made the point, you made it, the first speaker made it, still Latin America is far away from the levels of inequality that we have in Europe or even in the United States. Okay, so what's next? There's a long list of things that should come next, but let me just make a few. It's not just public expenditures that need to be less regressive. A very important point is that you actually have to scrutinize all of your policies, including your trade policies. Who benefits? Who pays? In order to really tackle this issue of deep poverty. Job creation is essential, as was said yesterday. You look at the other policies also, not just at what you spend and what you tax. And progress on these fronts has to go hand in hand with more inclusion in political institutions in order to do something about the inequality of influence, and I was very happy that political campaign financing came up several times. Now, let me just end with three issues which I, as a European looking at this continent, feel are essential to enable a virtuous cycle of democracy and growth and shared prosperity. One is, it has been mentioned, but I want to mention it again, taxation, public expenditure. As you said, if you look at income Gini coefficient before taxes and spending, Latin America and Europe are very similar. But wow, what a difference afterwards. That is a crucial point. Second point I want to make, the legislature has to approve the budget. And I was looking at the present state of democracies in Latin America, and I'm astonished. I've been a member of parliament for a decade. What do you do as a member of parliament if you don't approve the budget? The heart of democracy is taxation, public spending. The legislature should hold the purse. Third, last point, voters need to know what they actually vote for. Political parties are indispensable, but they need to be formed along programmatic or policy lines rather than vertical patronage-based. And parties need to formulate not just this vision of the future of the country, but also how do we get there step by step? What are the trade-offs if we do this and that? That should be a serious issue for parties to develop so voters actually know what they vote for. And also to deal with inequality. Political parties are critical. I myself come from the labor movement. To strengthen the capacity of the poor to articulate their interests, to organize themselves for platform and actions. If you don't have a clear party platform, even when there's a clear majority of citizens or maybe even voters, the poor will not influence policies that affect them. So finally, a quote from good old Adam Smith. He was absolutely right when he wrote that no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Adam Smith got it too.
Agradecemos a Eveline Herfkens su participación. Efectivamente, el debate sobre en qué se gastan los impuestos y cómo el gobierno los ejerce, pues está muy vinculado con la preocupación sobre todo
with the general concern of the poorest one, just to see if these resources or funds come from one pocket and go to another pocket in the appropriate manner. We're going to continue with our third panel member, and the floor is for Navin Chawla. He is the former president of the Indian Elections Commission from 2009 to 2010.
Muchísimas gracias al Fondo de
Valdez and Senor Manuel Caillo, officials of the IFE, who have worked so hard to organize this conference. The subject this morning is one of the most challenging that I have attended in many parts and at different forums in the developing world. I find 10 minutes, of course, very difficult, but we've all had to confine ourselves. So I have brought some papers and would request the Secretariat if that could be distributed, particularly to students who are at the back. And then they can get a glimpse of some of the things that are going on in poorer parts of the world. Distinguished members of the panel, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear students. I have to mention in the beginning that I've been described as a politician, and with all due respect to the politicians and very distinguished politicians here, I am actually a civil servant, and then after long years in the civil servants went into the Election Commission. I have just points to make, which is all I can do in these 10 minutes. Every country that aspires for democracy comes by different routes. Some countries embraced capitalism and the creation of wealth before becoming gradually democratic. Others had democratic institutions within their cultural matrix and embarked on wealth creation later and often after independence. Today there are many developing countries in that they're not dictatorships or centralized rule, and this is not necessarily related to per capita incomes. The past century was marked by struggle between democracy and totalitarianism in many parts of the world. The colonial powers had divided up the world, as you know, and democracy came to them when they aspired for and got independence and moved on to paths of self-determination. Till the 80s, the late 80s, we also had the world divided between the two power blocks, and there was the Cold War, and it was only after 1989 that once again many of the powers, many of the countries who were within the power blocks gained independence, and they are now at different stages of their paths to democracy. And so therefore, I would humbly say that a single definition of democracy is not easy. In India, When we got independence from colonial rule in 1947, we had a per capita income of less than $500. And today our per capita income, considerably less than Mexico's, is $1,500 per individual. But on the other hand, after we gained independence, India has, since 1947 and the adoption of its constitution in 1950, conducted elections each time, every time, and every time there has been an orderly transfer of power. There are many problems of poverty, but I do have to say that our people enjoy, and what is constitutionally enshrined, we have the freedom of speech. Many countries still don't have the freedom of speech. We have the rule of law. Many countries have varying rules of law. People have the freedom to assembly. They enjoy fundamental rights. They can criticize the government. They can criticize our leaders. We have a right to petition. We have a right to participate in politics and compete equally in each and every election. Our media is free, it's very vibrant, and it's constantly critical of our government and our politicians. We have grown exponentially in terms of our media in the last 20 years. There are now 1,000 channels. And I was part of the government when the government owned one channel. We now have 1,000 channels. We have 200 news channels. The 200 news channels are in all the different languages, and they are breaking news all 24 hours of the day. So we are in a constant state of being headlined. That's our media. But a very important pillar of democracy. There are many problems as have been raised by their excellencies. Your Excellency this morning, the problems of disenchantment with democracy. And this is common to a number of countries. The rapid growth of entrepreneurship has led to corruption, a kind of private compact that takes place in many countries between big business and between government officials. We see this as I travel around the world. I see it, of course, in my country, and I see it when I talk to election commissioners in every other country. In some countries, it's more camouflaged and more discreet. In some countries, it's more open. But it's one of the negatives of democracy, particularly when democracy is opening out to capitalism. So we have free growth. In our country, we've enjoyed 8% growth for several years. 30 million people enter our middle class every year. And the middle class has aspirations. And when those aspirations are not met, there is inevitably social tension. As far as the Election Commission is concerned, in spite of all the efforts that we make with every election, there is a way that candidates have of overspending beyond statutory limits. It is a problem. And I find it more camouflaged in other countries. Our politicians also camouflage, but at the time of elections, the only criteria for the person standing seems to be that I must win. But in spite of all this, in spite of the societal tensions that have emigrated, in spite of the fact that there are fragile democracies, I think it is the duty of those democracies that consider themselves the more established democracies in order to be able to always be sympathetic and to lend a helping hand wherever possible through financial institutions, because democracy, fragile democracy, growing democracy is always, always better than no democracy. Let me take you very briefly to our neighborhood, because I've come 27 hours at the invitation of His Excellency, Senor Valdez, to speak also a little about India. I am very grateful that I should be the perhaps only delegate from practically the whole of Asia and Africa. So I'll try not to exceed that 10 minutes, otherwise I know I'll be wrapped on my knuckles. But in 1947 and thereabouts, the countries that were under British colonial rule all got independence at about the same time. And we are markedly different now from our neighbors. 7 or 8 countries that should get independence from the same power at the same time have taken different paths and are on different stages of democracy. For example, in Pakistan next door, the army became a part of civilian administration from the beginning. And many of you here in this room are familiar with military rule. And the army has even now, therefore, taken roots in that country because it has entered into the administration from the beginning. And so although we have had democratic interludes in Pakistan, we have by and large had a period of military rule. To our north, in Nepal, we've had a monarchy. The monarchy was disabled by its people. It had to leave. A constitution has not been able to be framed, and the country has edged towards Maoist, anarchist rule of a kind. It still has a long way to go onto the democratic path. Burma, to our east, as you know, is only now under the leadership or under the beaconship, the idealship of Aung San Suu Kyi moving towards democratic roots. We know what's happening in Sri Lanka, which has moved from democracy to a somewhat more totalitarian government when, for instance, it dismissed its own Chief Justice. I have just come back from the Maldives, and in the Maldives it's been a work of progress, a work of democracy, and it has been halted. So it's a work in progress. One reason why India followed a particular path was the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. As a struggle began in India before it got its independence in 1947, there was a popular movement that consisted of the leadership of very wise leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar, and many others. They framed a wonderful constitution. But that freedom movement was led by Satyagraha, a peaceful resurrection, as it were, by Mahatma Gandhi. And so his philosophy was that we would fill the jails. We would fill the British jails, but we would fill them peacefully. We would show the other cheek. There would not be armed resurrection, which is why India did not enter into through a revolutionary path into where it is. Its institutions began to grow, and they were nurtured after independence. So today our progress was therefore, it led to higher education from the very beginning. It's led to education. When we conducted our first election, there was only 16% literacy. There is now 74%. So we've come a long way. There are problems. There are the problems where democracy and capitalism meet. Those were the problems that earlier capitalist countries dealt with. And so this is where we are today. I would thank you very much for having me today as a participant.
Muchas gracias a Navin Chawla, presidente de la Comisión de Elecciones de India, periodo 2009-2010, por las preguntas que nos vienen llegando del público.
Getting from the audience, the participation especially of the head of the Commission of Elections in India has turned out to be very interesting. I would just like to say that democracy in India is very known by Leonardo, who has had the chance to have a close relationship between IFE and India, and gives us a lot of examples of what the linkage of citizen participation means in a country with a huge population of over 1,200 million citizens, and an electorate role of 700 to 800 million. And this has to do a lot with the access of the citizens to democratic participation, with mechanisms such as electronic voting that we should start considering very seriously in countries such as Mexico, who has lots of lacks, as India used to have at the moment. We are going now to our next speaker. It's been very expected because Rosario Robles has together an experience as a party follower and was also as a governor. We have already said that she's the only woman that has been head of government in the Mexico City. And in these last 3 to 4 weeks, she has been very close to people that have underwent, that live in extreme poverty, which have also suffered the effects of natural disasters. So we are looking forward to the intervention of Rosario Robles. Thank you, Francisco Guerrero. I thank you to this invitation to this fourth Forum on Latin American Democracy. Thanks, Mr. Leonardo Valdez, chair of the IFE, for the invitation that I received a few months ago, and I wondered if I could be able to be here because I was in the state of Guerrero helping with the reconstruction of the area. But it is an honor to be in this panel with all these speakers that shared this with me. And first of all, I would like to say that Mexico, and I repeat something that Ciro Murayama was saying, has been focused in the last decade of the 20th century. Focused its combat in basing a democracy on one vote per person, a vote per person that should be counted and counted well. We had some advances in this regard, and we achieved that a vote was effective. We created institutions that were autonomous and that were in charge of organizing electoral processes. We made way to plurality and alternation. We created plural congresses, governments by several political parties, and we had a different presence at the municipal, state, and federal level. And we strengthened our representative democracy with lively participation of parties. However, this, although it's very significant, is not important when we are talking about full democracy. I believe that the first point that I want to set out is that democracy, as we've been saying since yesterday in this forum, cannot be exclusively limited to voting. Voting is a mechanism that makes us all equal. By issuing a vote, a woman is worth the same as a man, a poor person is worth the same as a rich one, an indigenous citizen is the same as any kind of citizen. Every vote has the same worth, the same value. However, if this vote and this representative system and this democracy are not translated into an improvement of the living conditions of the inhabitants, our democracy is incomplete. If this vote does not translate into the exercising of the social rights that is effective, of the economic rights, and in the participation of the majority of our society, our democracy is thus incomplete. Which is why it's very important, and I celebrate a lot that within this forum on democracy in Latin America, we are opening the floor to a debate on the topic if there could be a democracy for the poor, and I straightforwardly say that we can't. There can't be a democracy, and in Latin America we're talking about the whole region with over 160 million people that live in poverty. We cannot have a democracy if we don't translate this efficiently into a transformation of the daily life of the voters and of those people that participate in this democracy. There cannot be a democracy if the youth, who in the case of Mexico are our greatest population, we can't have it if they don't have the opportunities and they don't have aspirations. We cannot have democracy if women are still being abused, or even in the cases where their vote is decided with somebody else. So we have to make a reflection, I think, that goes beyond the democracy, formal democracy and representative democracy. Political parties in the Mexican state must undertake the challenge of creating a new social pact that allows to advance in the quality of democracy of our country. In Mexico, we used to say that there are 53 million people living in poverty. 43% of our population is living in poverty. Mexico, the highest decile earns 31 times more than the lowest. There is exclusion in Mexico and inequality, not just poverty. So we have to build a new framework of going from just voting to an effective exercise of rights. There is hunger in Mexico. We have always said since the beginning of this administration of President Enrique Peña Nieto. How can we think that 7 million Mexicans could exercise their political rights if there's hunger? And also, education is a mechanism for social mobilization by excellence. How can we then think about talking about a full democracy if there are children who don't have access to classes or to schools because they are the poorest in our country, because there are some other interests and that are giving more priority to this? So I believe that we indeed have to reflect on how are we going to build this democracy in a wholesome way. That means that we have to generate, from my point of view, the mechanisms that could strengthen our society and strengthen the Mexican state. On one hand, the mechanisms that allow that the social policies, and this is one of the greatest debates and one of the greatest points set out in the Pact for Mexico, that these are following the protective rights of corporate logics. How are we going to build this institutional scaffolding that allows us to protect these social policies? But this institutional scaffolding is not going to be enough if those who have right holders don't have those rights. If they understand their right as something they can solve, not as rights. If we are not creating citizens, we must go forward with this building of citizenship and social participation and communitary participation of those who are living in these poverty and inequality conditions. I dare say that many of the representation mechanisms that are current today cannot fully represent these millions of Mexican citizens that live in these poverty and inequality conditions. In the case of the situation of this contingencies that we are living in our country, particularly I was allocated to Guerrero, the state that was that had the most affections of these natural disasters. The institutional scaffolding there is very weak at the municipal level. It is so weak in that place where there is more poverty and more inequality. So we are not just talking about the exercising of citizenship. We have incomplete citizens while their rights cannot be fully exercised. which is why we have to go forward in focusing on the social aspect of social policies, and a focus on rights, and a focus on social participation and communitary participation, where those who are beneficiary of those rights become the real controllers of all these policies, and in which they have access to empowering levels where they make decisions, and when they have the chance to participate and orient of deciding where these resources are going to be oriented towards. But also, so that we can strengthen this environment of fighting poverty and inequality that are limiting our democracy, we should also leave behind the idea of having a limited and weak state. It's not about going back to authoritarian or model that was prevalent for decades in our country, but also in the fact that we have a tax authority that is strong, that is aimed towards lowering these inequality situations and in generating greater opportunities to those who live in poverty and people that live in extreme poverty, but at the same time creating a strong society, a society that is not just represented through political parties, but also that has instruments of participation that allow them to take part in the decision-making processes at any level in which they are talking about. I believe that if this logic of inequality and poverty prevails, or if this model in which nearly half of Mexicans are excluded prevails, simply apart on a policy in which we are subsidizing things, and we believe that by doing so we are building a democratic country. I think as long as we are doing all this, we are going to continue having an incomplete democracy, and we're going to continue living in a situation where most of the citizens in our country cannot exercise their political rights as they should, nor they will be able to exercise their political, social and economic rights. I would like to quote Carlos Fuentes, who is a quote that is very enlightening. No democracy can stand on the frail framework of poverty. That is the great challenge that we have as Latin America, the region with the most inequality, because we have a huge rate of poverty and inequality. That is the challenge that we're discussing today in Mexico. How can we generate the base and the foundations that allow to have this growth and development and a better distribution of the income, so that Mexicans can be first-class Mexicans, as our Constitution says they should be. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rosario Robles. I thank you for your participation. It is very interesting that the questions that I'm receiving, and also through the interventions that we've had, how whenever we have such when something happens that hurts a lot of people, and as we see in TV, not only during this administration but in administrations of other parties, we see that citizens are demanding that the authorities that manage social policies, they demand that help and resources that are aimed at avoiding or preventing this help and resources do not go through the hands of political parties. I've seen with the political representatives of different parties that they want help to get people directly without more intermediaries. I thank you all for your participation. It's being very rich. The audience is being very participative. I will give a quick reading of these questions, and we'll do a final round of questions where all our speakers could contribute. Now it's the turn to Flavia Freidenberg, who is an Argentinian Spanish academic, scholar. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this forum. I have the worst position here because you all want to leave, so I'd just like to sum up some of the things that I want to share with you in a very quick way, because I think that there have been some very interesting remarks, and I don't want to be repetitive. What we heard yesterday and what we heard this morning, we can have three basic conclusions. Elections are not enough. It's not just about being voted democratically. It's also about having a democratic administration. Inequality is totally unacceptable. Insecurity is unacceptable. The lack of dialogue and the lack of effort by the political elites, economical elites and social elites to generate agreements is totally unacceptable today in Latin American countries. And three, representative democracy should guarantee and ensure the welfare of our citizens. I think it would be great that in this forum we could stick together in concepts and messages that are clear, so people understand that being here every year means an advance in this democracy. This happens because in the last 30 years democracy hasn't been able to meet the demands of it's impossible that it meets all demands, but the majority of the demands, but especially on the inequality of citizens, as we were just saying with the intervention of Leonel Fernandez. Not all citizens in Latin America are equal. It depends if you're living in a city or in a rural country, if you're poor, if you're rich, if you're a woman, or if you're a man. It depends if you belong to youth or if you're indigenous. It depends if you're a recipient of a social program, if you have access to the internet or if you don't. As Carlos Mesa was saying yesterday, there are two worlds, and I believe it's more than two of those worlds in which there are several differences. A Latin America that's well connected to the world, and a Latin America that doesn't belong to this world, but that is able to see this in this 140 characters of Twitter or on TV. Even if they want to have a dialogue, it's not heard. They see things on Facebook. They see this on reality. There's a new generation that has a new participation and a new way of understanding politics. But there is also lots of people that don't have access to these new resources that are generating. Or if they have access, they just do it as an audience. We have some serious problems of social citizenship, and we are creating democracies with adjectives. Each of my colleagues is thinking about what's the adjective that they're going to use to create a new concept of democracy and to say something new about democracy. And I would like to call the attention on that there is no need to look for new objectives. We have to focus in that representative democracy complies with the functions that needs to commit to. I'm sorry, Dante, this is the most boring part of all, reading figures, but if we don't see figures, there we have 177 million poor peoples. Of these, 170 million are indigenous citizens. This is a shame. People with the lowest income has about 15% of the total income, while 10% of the population has the highest income, that is 33%. Ciro, the figures that you were giving for Mexico are not just for Mexico. We could translate them into other countries in Latin America. The 5% supersedes 18.3 times the lowest 5%. But if you see a particular group to which I want you to see today is women, the figures are way more alarming. 30% of the poorest women in Latin America that live in Latin America cities has no incomes of their own. The proportion of men in the same condition is just of 12.3%. Among the poorest women, we have the youngest, those who are between 15 and 24 years old. Those are the women that have the least income of their own, and 57% of these women don't have an income at all. This differences are incredible if we do this analysis by country. In Nicaragua, women with no income represent 50% of the population. Honduras, Bolivia, and Paraguay, it's 32%. In 8 countries in Latin America, Bolivia, Colombia, El Salvador, Ecuador, Paraguay, Mexico, and Dominican Republic, over 75% of the women of 65 years old have no retirement services or benefits. The sense of defenselessness and unequality of these figures speak by themselves. We are not going to talk about salary differences or the salary gap. Women earn way less than men in the same conditions. Inequality is very clear. Only 5 Latin American Congress have more than 35% of women as representatives and lawmakers. We're not going to say that we have only 3 women president. Many people say, well, you should be happy. At least you have 3 women that are president. But if you consider that it's more than 50 years since the women's vote was constitutionalized, this figure is alarming. In 2012, Brazilian, Haitian, and Barbadian Congress and assemblies have less than 10% of women participation. Colombia and Uruguay have 12% of women's participation as lawmakers. At the municipal level, we only have 2,163 women as majors in a total of nearly 19,000 municipalities in the region, and in 17 countries out of 22, women that are majors, it's lower than 15%. If we've had some advances in terms of parity, or if we talk about quota laws in terms of improving female representation, we can see this difference when we're talking about a legislative entity or body where we have the most efforts, or in terms of executive institutions. Men are not voting for women, women are not voting for women. When we must have access and control to the resources, quotas is not a topic that is very clear and discussed. So these figures are talking to us about concrete inequality that is clear in Latin America today. How can we get rid of this? By listening to Helen, I can think of a virtuous cycle. I don't know if you are going to share this, but from all these interventions, I've set out a new virtuous cycle. 1, the first element is resources. If Latin American citizens don't like paying taxes and don't make strong states, it is very complicated to have a strong state that is capable of solving problems. Thus, we need a very strong tax policy and a redistribution policy. Citizens should know what are they voting for, but they should also know what their taxes are being spent on. We have the need for transparent systems so that citizens know where their taxes are going to. We should have rule of law and elections. Of course, elections should go on, and there should be a routine about this. There's a huge discussion on how should we be making quality discussions. We move beyond clean and free elections. We should have quality in elections. So we shouldn't have skills that are balanced towards one side or other. We should have players that are playing on their own in these elections and are winning completely to the competence. This is not a clear evidence of quality elections. We should also generate accountability mechanisms so that citizens know what they have to control. Fourth element, going from to rights, we have had great advances in constitutionalizing politics, and I salute this, but this doesn't work to me. It's not good if rights are in paper, but people can't exercise them. 5, trust. We need political capital and democratic education. as Helen said. And 6, we need new politicians. We need new elites. Or we need that all the politicians learn what a Twitter and Facebook is. You cannot make politics nowadays if you don't overcome this technological gap. I'm sorry and I apologize to all politicians, because citizens are now expecting responses and answers. As I said, inequality is the predator of the political class. And I say, yes, it's true, we should eradicate and get rid of this. But we need strong institutions, citizens that are committed, and we need politicians that are committed to getting rid of this poverty and strengthening democracy. We need to renew leadership, and we need to stop waiting for politicians to solve our problems. We, as citizens, need to make commitments with democracy, and if democracy costs, as we know it costs, citizens need to know why it costs, and to be accountable of and give them the control of what the needs of their democracy. I hope I have encouraged you a little. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Flavia for her intervention. I think she has encouraged us, and she has given us a lot of topics to think about. We have nearly 30 minutes to conclude. I have a huge amount of questions. If you'd like, we are going to do as follows. I'm going to read these questions, and I suggest that our speakers pay attention. Some of these questions are aimed at one person in particular. Some others are open to all of you. And after reading these questions, we would have a final round when I will give you between 3 to 5 minutes for you to have a final remark. Jorge Perez from IFE asked, is the size of a social assistance of a government the size of its shame? What should be the limits of social assistance to avoid Martin Gonzalez asks, what reduces poverty the most? More resources to social programs or more sources of jobs? Hugo Sanchez Casas from UNAM says, and this is aimed to Rosario, the National Crusade Against Hunger, how would this work to diminish poverty? Is this a policy that is aimed at disappearing poverty? Does it has long-term objectives? Luis Flores asks, how can citizenship take part in social and economical decisions if they don't have access to education, not even to second-class education? Concepcion Vasquez asks, facing low education and alphabetization, is this right? Why is not a benefit visible, and they don't understand the benefit and function of elections? Abraham Escalona from the law postgraduate program, and it's saying that Ciro Murayama. What is your opinion about political transformation? Can we change ideologies from one moment to the other? From this, could this cause a social fracture by not having a representative figure that is consistent and congruent? If citizens could actually become controllers of the parties? Eduardo Peredo from the School of Law in San Luis Potosí asks Rosario Robles, we have talked about the problem of why democracy does not generate equality in Mexico. What mechanisms do you think we could have to overcome these difficulties? From Calmeca Alianza Ciudadana, we have the question. In the crusade against hunger, the OCCs that work in communities with poverty and extreme poverty are relegated. What are the mechanisms that we should follow to be part? Because human capital matters, but the economic policy also matters, and it's been ruled by a very conservative vision. In Mexico, the policy to fight poverty has had its own results. It is
quite followed and awarded by the World Bank. But it is not a policy for reallocation. It's just to reduce what the economic policy is doing. And as long as they are not together, the social policy is going to be just the ambulance to remediate the issues. I am very sorry to say that inequality could be acceptable, and it could be acceptable because in Mexico we are creating a conservative point of view from the fiscal point of view because everybody is protecting their own rights. So it's acceptable, and we are not ashamed of it. We put it on the news. Everybody is in agreement to get rid of the value-added tax on tuition. The right that they are not fighting for the right to have public education, but my right not to pay value-added and not in the and also in the income tax. So we have a very conservative society. So inequality is somehow accepted. And another problem is that the Mexican state, and I think this happens in other places of Latin America, but I don't want to judge from my seat. It's an accomplice of inequality, and it's actually the creator of the inequality. We have the remote schools, the elementary schools without drinking water, 30% of the ones that we have in our country, and the state is reproducing inequality. And the same thing happens with our healthcare system and with the insurance, the popular insurance, which is just low quality. Mr. Bright, in his book, The Culture of Satisfaction in a U.S. Society of 2/3, excluding 1/3, I think we can apply it to Mexico, but not 2/3 of people that live good and forgets about the 1/3. I think that according to the INEGE information, we can talk about 1/5 with 4/5 excluded. And this is totally unacceptable, and with this I finish. I think we have also the emergency of demography. We are in an institution with a lot of specialists in demography. Young people are not going to wait for us. It is a pity that since 2008, the main reason of death in reproductive age from 15 to 49 is murder. If we do not offer security, if we do not offer education, and if we don't create jobs, the only thing that we're going to have, Marx said it, it's an industrial army of reservation. What we have in our towns and cities, a very large army of organized crime. Thank you to Ciro Murayama. Now I pass the floor to Eveline Herfkens. Estas preguntas en realidad.
Make one remark and I will answer three of them. One is that when I was shortening my speech, I threw out an important part that Flavia picked up, and I want to underline the importance of it. Transparency of public expenditure can double the money available for the purpose that the spending is for. So I think that's an enormous important point, and I'm afraid pretty relevant in this continent. Secondly, interesting question, the size of social systems. I come from a society where at the time that I was running for parliament, you could still win elections with saying we're going to increase taxes. So the appetite of society differs. But I was on the commission, Michelle Bachelet of the ILO and the World Health Organization on social protection. And what I find interesting is indeed that some societies choose to make a social system like a minimum pension available for everybody. We did that in our country. It makes it easier for the elite to pay for the rest if they also get a penny at the end of the day when they are old. That's one thing. The other way is to really target it. And I found interesting that they found out about the targeting of social programs in Latin America, the cash transfers, that actually the conditions were not needed. That if you give the poor a little bit more money, the first priority would be to send the kid to school. So the conditions are not necessary. But politically, attaching conditions makes it easier for the rich to be generous and give that money. So this is all very political, and I think it changed different per society. Second question I want to say something about is the issue raised, what can civil society do when your government fails to do enough about poverty? Now, you can always go into the charity business and start your own schools, but in the long debate over the decades I had with NGOs involved in development, I always says, don't build schools, empower citizens to demand that their government deliver for them to fulfill basic rights like education. I think it's way more important to do that, and it will really also foster democracy. Third thing, I want to say something about the mechanisms to solve poverty and inequality. I want to come back to the point that doing something about inequality and poverty is not just about social spending. I was explaining how institutions historically in Latin America have framed rights and laws in a way to benefit the elite. Look at all of your policies. Poor people, to become productive, need access to land, access to credit. What is your financial system? You need financial reform to enable them to get access. What is access to land? How is that regulated here? Look at your trade policy. Look at what do you protect and who benefits, and what don't you protect.
Independent Election Commission, very independent courts, the Supreme Court, the High Courts. We have a very powerful and free media. We have a social commission for the minorities. We have a social commission for women. We have social commission for gender justice. We have human rights commissions. So these are all institutions that are growing, and these institutions are helping in order to reduce some of the ethnic and social tensions in my country. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Navin Chawla. Pasamos ahora a los comentarios finales de Rosario Robles, secretaria de Desarrollo Social.
Muchas gracias. Yo lo primero que podría decir es que para combatir la pobreza y modificar esta condición que es histórica, si nosotros vemos la gráfica de los últimos 30 años, la pobreza en términos porcentuales se ha mantenido igual. Tenemos que crecer, tiene que haber crecimiento económico en el país, con las tasas de crecimiento que hay en México.
Growth rates that we have in Mexico, it is very unlikely that we will be able to transform this poverty situation of so many Mexicans. Creation of employment and income reallocation, yes, we do not only need to grow if we do not have an adequate reallocation of income, and that's why we've done all these efforts, beginning with the Pact for Mexico and also supported by Congress to create reforms with which we can establish the baseline for better growth, for better economic competition. We have the academic reform, the financial reform, with which we're going to allow access to credit with more favorable conditions. And the two reforms that are currently being discussed in Congress, which were actually presented by the executive branch, Mr. Peña Nieto, are actually the tax reform and the power reform, or the energy oil reform. And here we have a question. When we talk about matters that have to do with growth, with the creation of resources, with the development of funds with which we can satisfy the needs of our population, of the majority of our population, that are presented with political reforms that will create the conditions and that will protect a political sector that may be very important and very necessary, but that they could not be the conditioning element of another type of reforms that are totally needed for our country. So this is quite a matter going on that has to do with the quality of our politics and the priorities that we have set up as the political class. with regard to the challenges that Mexico faces. Secondly, the tax reform is fundamental for social reform. I think that the most important part of this tax reform in Mexico is that it actually has a social address. First, because it is taking for granted that a large amount of this income is going to be used for a universal social regime. This is the unemployment insurance and the retirement plan and the health care plan with which we're going to have the possibility to offer access to health care to a population. And secondly, because this reform, it's a reform that sets up that those that have more should pay more. But Ciro is right. Those of us that look at this reform are only wanting to protect or privilege, just as in the academic reform, specific privileges, because this reform wants to eliminate some of these privileges. For example, the tax consolidation regime, that for the very first time speculative capital be taxable, and to reduce the participation of the lower classes to pay the value-added tax in food. We are protecting 14 million of Mexicans by not having this increase of value-added tax, because otherwise the middle class would go into poverty. However, what's being argued is if actually the privilege, especially of some sectors, is being given or not, or is now eliminated. We know that our country needs these funds, and I agree totally with this. These tax collection, or the greater tax collection, what are they going to do with it, and how is it going to be accountable to the citizens? That is something that has not been said. And finally, what we've been working on is in the redesign of social programs. The figures that speak about the stagnation of poverty that has been contained, that the Coneval has already said by simulating a system without monetary transferences, without oportunidades, we would say that instead of 53 million you cannot think. You say, no, but those people, they just don't work. How can they work? They can't eat. They don't eat. How can they be productive? How can they have an opinion? And the program is also linked to the production of food, and it's also linked to a basic baseline of right exercisement with the topic that I consider very important in the area of democracy. Instead of giving a money transfer in an individual basis, which actually breaks up the idea of a community, we are presenting a different system with the participation of the community. They organize their own meetings, they organize themselves, the community creates its own committees, and the committees give continuity to the process related with this national fight against hunger. I think this is quite a turn in our public policies that gives power to the community and gives power to women, because we have seen that half of the committees need to be made up of women so that they can be part of this social auditing system. And I finish by saying, how can we make sure that all these programs are not used for electoral purposes? Well, by creating a single beneficiary roster so that they are all in the same program, state, municipal, or federal programs. The ones that have the right to that social program are in these only one beneficiaries roster that no one can use, that no one can manipulate, and therefore the access to the different social programs would be guaranteed, and we would have an adequate auditing unit. To finish, I want to say that I am proud to be a citizen of a country where 37% of the Senate is made up of women. 37% of the senators in Mexico are women. And in October 17, we are going to be celebrating the 60 years of the right to vote for women. But unfortunately, we do not have yet this female representation in local congresses. Thank you very much. Now we pass the floor to Flavia Freidenberg. Well, actually, part of what I was going to say was already said by the minister. I congratulate you for the efforts being carried out in Mexico with regard to the way in which you are doing the money transfer to the people, because that is not good. What we find in Latin America is that for this strategy trying to fight poverty and inequality, the state usually just creates new programs and gives conditioning money transfers or benefit transfer that are just that reproduce the traditional political way of doing things, and that's it. So that is one of the things that I wanted to speak about, especially when talking about what type of citizens are created. If in order to be in this system they need to receive a subsidy, a monthly subsidy, in order to reach a basic subsistence condition. We have to think about this, because sometimes the answer of some countries to reduce inequality is the creation of these patronage systems in which they are only reducing the power of the individuals. There was a question on what is the civil society doing when the governments don't do anything. I think that in Latin America we already have a lot of people already working, either in the streets or on the web, on the Twitter, on Facebook, or on local congresses, analyzing what's the state going to do with the funds it has. For example, some experiences in Chile, Ciudadano Inteligente. Why don't you browse it? It's Ciudadano Inteligente in Chile and Ciudadanía 2.0 in Argentina. In Ecuador, Ecuador Vota, where they give and share information with the citizens so that they can decide which politicians are closer to the results being carried out online, on the surveys online. But the thing is that citizens have now more knowledge on what does being a citizen means. Eveline has given us a lot of recipes on what we have to analyze to see the system in which we are. But the thing is that we need the citizens to participate. And we've seen for these 30 years of democracy that citizens just expect the politicians to solve everything, and they just want to receive the answer. They have lots of expectations, but they can all be met. Not always can we offer access to all the information in order to develop your own judgment. And I think that it is control and accountability, two main elements of democracy. We're looking at the Latin American democracy from the point of view of Mexico. Mexico is one case, but we have other cases. We have countries that currently feel that democracy is actually meeting their demands. In many of the countries in the Andean area feel that they have received their demands, and if you look at this, most of the time these systems have been just based upon this type of systems that are just patronage systems. So there is a relationship between the system of inclusion and what the state is offering. And I guess we have to once again analyze the type of citizens that we are creating with these answers. Thank you.
I would like to thank Flavia for her participation. I would just like to add 2 final remarks. I finished my period as an electoral councillor on October 30th. This is the last forum that I will be participating as a co-organizer. And I would like to thank you. I would like to make 2 acknowledgements. First, to Manuel Carrillo. If someone doesn't know Manuel Carrillo, you have no idea what's the international activity of IFE. Manuel is a great asset of the Instituto Federal Electoral. Thank you, Manuel, for these 5 years of organizing several activities. Mexico is known in the whole world in electoral matters thanks to the efforts of Manuel since IFE was founded. And if we become another institution, I am sure that we will still require Manuel's work. Second, I would like to thank Leonardo Valdez. We have shared a great impulse to the Institute's activities. We both believe that it is important that IFE connects with the several schools of thought and the several regions. IFE is very important in the international community. Leonardo, congratulations and thank you for your participation on these topics. Thank you, Francisco Guerrero, for your words. I am truly thankful. I would like to invite our audience to the next panel because it's very important. We have first-class speakers with experience without a comparison. I know the schedule is kind of difficult, but we have Karina Pereira, who was promoting elections for Haiti, Iraq and Afghanistan. That is not something easy to do. We have also Roberto Campa in charge of security topics, Dr. Sergio Garcia Ramirez, a Mexican scholar, and we also have Paulina de Arte, who has something to tell us about the OAS security report. So please be here, don't miss it. Thank you very much.